Okay, well, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this symposium for inviting me to speak. And also, I would like to acknowledge at the very beginning our ongoing collaboration with Professor Shiori and Dr. Kuriki here at the Institute. Much of what I'm going to be talking about today is closely related to our ongoing work with them. So, I'd like to talk about the origins of color communication. And for about the last 15 years or so, Angela Brown and I have been interested in what would seem to be a rather boring subject, namely how people name colors. What I hope to convince you in this talk, however, is that it is a very important task to study, and for a number of years it's been used as an important paradigm for studying how people around the world build mental representations about their environment, and has very good applications, for example, in the area of artificial intelligence. So it turns out that, of course, humans can discriminate on the order of millions of different colors, but we don't have names for all of those different colors. Instead, around the world, people in their languages tend to restrict their naming to just a few color categories. In English, red, green, blue, yellow, and so forth. Most modern advanced cultures follow in a similar way, although there are interesting individual differences among these different cultures. This particular diagram here is called a consensus plot, and it simply shows how if you ask a large number of people to name each of the colors that are shown in this lower portion of the slide here, that you get very high consensus in some regions of the color chart, and somewhat low consensus near the borders between different named categories. Anyway, that's the story among modern industrialized societies, relative similarity across those societies. However, it's been known for over 150 years that if you look in pre-industrial societies, you find striking variation in how people around the world name colors. And in the 1960s, Paul Kay and Brent Berlin made a very interesting discovery. They found that if you looked at these in a systematic way, what you'd find is that all of that variation, in fact, could be summarized in terms of a sort of more or less linear progression in color naming, from very simple color naming systems involving only two color terms to more complex color naming systems such as English and Japanese and so forth that are represented down here. And they propose that the reason for this variation that you observe here is because different languages are at different stages of what they called a color term evolution. And the idea was that all languages begin very simple, and then in a very stepwise and more or less predictable way, these color naming systems or lexicons step from simple to complex. So a number of years ago, Angela and I began to examine this premise of color term evolution. And we did so by looking at a very large data set called the World Color Survey, only over 2,600 subjects from representing 110 pre-industrial societies. And what we did was a cluster analysis where we actually looked at how all of the terms used in all of those various languages by all of those individuals actually compared. And what we found through this cluster analysis is that, in fact, all of the naming could pretty much be summarized in terms of a set of color categories that all of these various languages and individuals had in common, which are represented here. We refer to this as a universal glossary. We could then take this universal glossary and use it to compare the color naming systems across all of the different languages in the World Color Survey. And that is represented here. And strikingly, what we found is despite a large degree of variation across all these different languages, nonetheless, their color naming systems tend to fall into roughly 4 categories, based primarily on how the blue and green region of the color chart was actually named. So, for example, in some languages, they were very much in the spirit of modern languages. That is, in particular, greens and blues and purples were each given a separate category. On the other hand, in other languages, in fact, this constituted the majority of those that we encountered in the World Color Survey, a single term was used to name blue, green, and oftentimes purple. Still other languages would use the term that was used to name gray, and a fourth category or motif of subjects tended to use the word for dark or black to name blues and greens and oranges, and blues and greens and purples. And so we thought now that with the statistical tools in hand, we could then go back and actually look at the distribution of these different color naming systems across the different languages around the world. And what we found, much to our amazement, is that these different color naming systems not only could be observed in different languages, but strikingly, they could also be observed in most of the individual languages. So we refer to this as individual differences. And you can see, for example, in this case, language number 1 in the World Color Survey out of 110, about half of the individuals in this particular sample expressed what we call the dark motif. But the other half were approximately equally divided among each of the other 3 motifs which we described in our cluster analysis. And so, far from languages being distinguished from one another in terms of falling wholly within each of these categories, what we found is that the language could be described in terms of the relative prevalences of the different motifs represented. So in this way, getting back to the original question about how color terms or how color terminology evolves, what we were observing here is something that's very much like biological evolution. Instead of languages lurching from one particular state to another, instead what we find remarkably is that in many cases, almost all of those states are present in the language community, and instead they vary in terms of prevalence. Here, for example, is just a really good example is the language Gunu, which most would categorize as a so-called dark language because many of the informants expressed this particular motif. But what you can see if you actually analyze all of the individuals that were studied in this particular language, you can see things that are very much English-like, such as here, Gru-like, and so forth. So lots of variation within the same language is the key idea here. We also, when we went back and actually looked at English, we also found very interesting systematic variations as well. So recall this chart that I showed you of consensus, in which there is this region, this dark band here, which represents low consensus in how people named this particular range of colors. What we found is, in fact, our individuals in our study could be clustered into 2 groups. One where they differed very much in terms of how they used the word green or blue. But strikingly, there was yet another group of individuals who did not use either green nor blue, but used a term turquoise or teal to represent yet another color category in that boundary. So the lack of consensus that we saw here among all of our subjects could be broken down into variation in the usage of blue and green, plus variation in actually the use of an entirely different color term, as you see here. So this led us to ask the question, well, if we were to go back in some sense in cultural time to actually examine this process of color term evolution, what might we find? So what if we could go so far back in some sense that we might actually reach a state where there might be very little in the way of color categorization? First of all, would that be possible? And secondly, what might it look like? And a couple of years ago, we had the opportunity to study color naming in a group of nomadic hunter-gatherers known as the Hadza. They live in Tanzania, in Africa. They are nomadic and therefore have very little in the way of technology. Basically everything that they own, they carry on their backs from one encampment to the next. Their lifestyle is much like what we would think that pre-industrial cultures practiced tens of thousands of years ago. And so we were interested in, well, what their color naming systems might look like. And this work was done in collaboration with a group at the University of Pennsylvania, headed by Corin Apicella, and an anthropologist, and David Brainerd, a psychologist like ourselves. And in order to deal with the vicissitudes of measuring color naming out in the field, literally, what we did is, instead of having people name this wide range of colors, which is represented on the chart, we in fact picked just a small sample of 23 colors. These represented best examples of the English basic color terms that I showed you a little bit earlier on. We also picked other colors as well that were based on our study of the English color lexicon a couple of years ago. And we had basically our Hadza informants name each of those colors using a single word, or crucially, if they didn't know a word for that color, if they didn't think there was one in their language, to say don't know. We studied not only the Hadza, but we also did control studies in Somali and English. And here are the basic results from that study that I want to show you today. These are the results from our English controls. They're in the form of what we call bubble charts. Along this column right here are the names of the different color samples that each of our subjects named. And at the top here, A through B prime, are indices into common color terms that were used by our English informants. And basically what you can see here is that there was very good consistency in color term usage by our English subjects, as indicated by the very large bubbles, indicating that basically all of our subjects would name colors in a particular way. And you can see this very nice progression in the sense that certain groups of color terms tend to be used to name certain colors, so producing this very nice diagonal representation. So for example, the color that we would call mustard, the most common term used among our English informants was word I, which would be brown. And importantly, you'll notice here that basically all of our subjects had words for all of the colors that we showed them. The use of don't know was in fact quite rare. We got a very different pattern of results, however, when we studied our Hadza. The first thing to notice is that for a given color, there was an extraordinary range of terms that each of our Hadza informants would use to name that particular color. And similarly, if we were to look at the usage of a particular term, for example, the term Katahira, what we found is that strikingly that term could be used to name a wide variety of colors that we would certainly not think of as falling into the same color category. We refer to this property of the language Hadzane as being diverse, in the sense of that the color words that are actually used vary significantly. However, it's also important to recognize that the vast majority of responses that we got from our informants of Hadzane, in fact, were don't know. In most cases, informants simply had no idea what to name the color. However, there was a third and very important outcome from our study of the Hadza. So this is the bubble chart that I showed you just on the previous slide. And down here, I actually represent, in terms of color charts, the naming of, here's 6 out of our nearly 60 informants in this particular study. And one of the things that you see is, for example, this subject here named 2 of the colors. He named one, probably using the word for red, and another for that might represent blue. But you can see that these different informants, in fact, are naming not only different numbers of colors, but also different constellations of colors. So there's great diversity not only in the names that they use, but also in particular in the colors that they're actually going to name. But more importantly, what you can see here is that in some of the cases, there are single terms that are being used to name multiple colors, here and here and here. And if we plot across all of our 50 to 60 observers shown down here in what I call a color association plot, what you see is these lexically distinguished groups of colors, which we call lexical color groups. You can see that they tend to be concentrated in regions of the color chart that are very familiar to those of, either in English or in Japanese. There's greenness, there's blue, there's red, there's yellow, and so forth. And so even though most of the Hadza don't know the name for colors, and even though when they deploy names, they seem to be using words that lack consistency or consensus within the language community, nonetheless, remarkably, they are using them in a way that is very reminiscent of modern color naming systems. We can compare them, in fact, here, where this is now the recapitulation of the English data that I showed you, and down here is the pattern that we find in our color association chart for about 50 to 60 English informants. And then finally, though I've not said a lot about them yet, Somali, which is a language that is spoken in a region of Africa geographically nearby where the Hadza are. And you can see that their use of don't know is somewhat intermediate between the Hadza and English. And so too is their color association network. So what we think that we're observing here is evolution in a very interesting way, that all of the precursors for the basic color categories that we observe in modern color lexicons are present even as far back in, if you will, cultural time as we can go, yet not particularly well organized, and over time they organize into more distinctive and high consensus terms. Okay, and this is just, we can come back to this if there's time, it's just meant to represent a statistical analysis that verifies what I had just said. Okay, so with all of this diversity, we began to wonder, well, just how much color communication, in fact, are there, for example, in the World Color Survey, and how does it compare with the Hadza, and so on and so forth. And so this has led us to develop a sort of a mathematical or a theoretical framework, which we are continuing with today, which we refer to as the color communication game. And it's based on a very straightforward information theoretic scenario, which I can describe here. So imagine that you have two participants in a game, a sender and a receiver separated by a baffle. The sender has some colors in front of him, and the receiver tries to guess with an identical set of colors what the sender's choice is on each of a number of trials in which the sender chooses a color at random from this ensemble. Now, clearly, in the absence of any communication between the two individuals, the receiver's performance is going to be a chance, which in this case, because there are 23 samples, would be about 4.5 bits. On the other hand, if the sender now emits a message that the receiver understands, it's not going to guarantee that he will be able to guess the sender's choice, but we will improve the probability that he will be able to do so. And that, in information theoretic terms, is referred to as mutual information. And so we can express the usage of color terms within the World Color Survey, as well as the data that I just showed you for our Hadza and Somalis and so forth, in terms of these units of bits, which represent mutual information in the use of the terms. And those are the results of our analysis of the World Color Survey. Here on the x-axis, we plot the number of common terms that are used in each of these language communities, and on the y-axis is the mutual information. And one of the things that you can see, first of all, is that overall, color communication is relatively, or color coding is relatively low, peaking out at somewhere between 1.5 and 2 bits, regardless of the number of terms that are in common usage within the lexicon. Moreover, if we plot our data on the same graph, where we allowed our subjects to say don't know if they weren't sure about what to call it, what we see is that, strikingly, these different languages fall very close to the regression line through the data, indicating that despite the use of don't know, color communication is not hugely different than in studies where subjects have been required to give names for all of the color terms. Not only that, but we can actually look at how well subjects perform relative to what we might think of as optimal in terms of the color terms that they actually think that they know about. And what you can see is that in every single case, actual color coding as represented by this regression line falls well below what you would predict based on the actual terms that are used by these individuals. So suggesting that in these different societies, people have words for colors, but there's no consensus, there's no agreement on precisely how they might be used. Just a couple of examples I want to run through very quickly here. This is a language that's spoken by Murrin-Patha, spoken by Aboriginals in Australia. And the key thing here, basically to note, is that, again, the striking variability. The arrows indicate here that in some cases, color categories exist in some individuals that are completely absent in many others. And indeed, if you look at these, you'd say, well, gee whiz, these really don't look like very organized systems at all. And indeed, that's what we would argue as well. In fact, we would go one step further. Well, that's not good. We would go one step further and in fact show that for terms that are in common usage in each of these two languages, here are 3 terms, here are 2 terms, the striking variation in how those terms are used, very much in the spirit of what we saw among our Hadza informants. In fact, you can see that in some cases, in fact, the same term is used to name colors that, according to color vision theory, would be mutually exclusive percepts. And so, again, very striking variation in color term usage. The final thing that I want to talk about now is, in essence, where we sort of close the loop in terms of our color communication scenario. All of the analyses that I've talked about heretofore have to do with applying communication theory to the terms that people use, and I refer to that as color coding. Now we ask the question, well, actually, how good are they at actually using the terms that they deploy? I've speculated that there might be a lot of diversity. Let's actually measure that in a group of individuals. And we've done that by implementing the color communication game in an iPad application, which subjects in our lab actually play. They play it in groups here represented by 4, where each individual player is shown each of a series of colors, which they are asked to name using a single word. That's sort of the first phase of the experiment. And in this phase, that's the sender phase, where they're generating messages. And so each of the individuals playing this game at any particular point in time names the same set of colors. There is then a subsequent so-called identification phase where individuals are confronted not only with the color terms that they use, but also the color terms that others in this particular instantiation of the game have also used. And this is what we find. So on the x-axis here, I've sorted the order of, in this case, 18 subjects in terms of their optimal color communication. The dashed line up here is how well they would perform if they had a separate color term for each of the colors that they were confronted with. You can see that that falls significantly below the line, indicating that the same words are oftentimes used to name similar different colors. So, for example, the different blues and greens that are encountered in that sample. Down here is the group mutual information, which is calculated from the equation that I showed you just a little while ago. And this represents then what we would expect to be a lower bound in terms of how our subjects actually performed. Here now are the results for individual subjects that are actually, in essence, communicating with themselves. So they named each of the colors, and then in a subsequent phase, we asked them to identify the colors based on their names. And strikingly, what you see is, in fact, their performance actually falls below optimal, indicating that even though they may use these terms, they're not really clear at the time that they're using them precisely what they mean, and have difficulty then retrieving information about how that color term was actually used. More interesting is that we find that color communication in our sample, when they are actually communicating with others, is not hugely different from what you would observe in color communication among the individuals with themselves. And we did a regression analysis, and this just is meant to indicate overall, when we simply fit linear functions through those data, this is really the difference that we've actually measured between our theoretical calculation based on color terminology within English and the actual observation of color communication within this particular group. And similarly, a little bit differently, we find here in the case of the diamonds, this is now when subjects are actually asked to identify the colors given by all the various other individuals that they're playing with at any particular time. Here is now a comparison of English and Somali. We find, again, pretty much the same patterns. This is another study, larger numbers of subjects. The key idea here is that the basic results replicate. That is, this striking difference between optimal and actually observed. And not surprisingly, we find a similar pattern in our Somalis as well. It's just that overall color communication is somewhat lower. So in conclusion, hope I've convinced you that there are large individual differences in color cognition around the world, not only in pre-industrial societies, but also in English and some modern color naming systems as well. And we believe that it plays a very important role in driving color term evolution. We argue that many of the basic elements of more advanced color naming systems can be represented even at the very earliest stages of color term evolution. So these, if you will, species exist within the culture. What changes as color terms evolve, color terminology evolves over time, is the relative prevalences of these, if you will, memes that we can observe within the general population. At very earliest stages of color term evolution, we think indeed the color categories are sparse. People are unsure about how to name the colors that they see in front of them. They are diverse, as I pointed out, lacking consensus. But finally, most importantly, they are distributed in the sense that we see these advanced systems implicitly in the language community. And then finally, color communication efficiency is substantially lower than predicted by the number of color terms in common use in a community. The key idea here is that in order to know how to use color terms, you have to know what they mean. You can only do that through practice, if you will, and if it's important within the community. We argue that well beyond the number of terms that people actually use, there's a much smaller group of colors that are actually used meaningfully and with high efficiency within the culture. So I want to thank, again, the organizers of this symposium. I want to thank our subjects, our interpreters, and our collaborators, Corin Apicella and David Brainerd, for their contributions to our study. Thank you.
Thank you, David.